For seconds. That's how long it took for 11 years of marriage to end. Renee Carter stood outside room 918 with her hand raised to knock, flowers in her other hand, a dress she'd picked out because he used to love it. And then she heard a voice through that door that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. But the sentence that broke her that day wasn't the one she overheard behind that door. It was one she'd already been carrying, silently, for years. And this was simply the moment she finally decided to give it back. What Renee did with that sentence, in the weeks that followed, is the part of this story that nobody sees coming. Stay with me till the end, because the real twist in this video isn't what happened at that hotel. It's what Renee had been quietly holding on to long before she ever knocked. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Renee Carter was 38 years old. She had 2 children, a house on Maple Crest Lane in a quiet suburb outside Columbus, Ohio, and 11 years of a marriage she had spent most of her adult life believing was solid ground. She met Marcus Carter when she was 26, waiting tables to pay for nursing school, and he was finishing his second year of law school, charming in the specific way that made older women at the restaurant say, "That one's going somewhere." He was going somewhere. She just hadn't understood, yet that somewhere wouldn't always include her. In the early years, it was good, genuinely good. She remembered the apartment they shared before either of them had any money, a fold-out couch, a window unit that barely worked, and the two of them eating cereal for dinner and laughing about it because they were young enough that struggle still felt like an adventure they were having together. Marcus made partner at his firm 9 years into the marriage. That was the year everything started to shift, slowly, in ways so small that Renee spent a long time not naming them. Stay with me, because the years that came after that promotion are the years that built the exact silence Renee would later use against him. The comments started small. "You've let yourself go a little. You used to care more about how you looked," said lightly, almost as jokes, the kind of comments you're supposed to laugh off so you don't seem too sensitive. Then came the late nights that stretched later, the work trips that multiplied, the way Marcus started angling his phone away from her on the kitchen counter, a small motion so practiced it barely looked like anything at all. Renee noticed. She always noticed. But noticing and confronting are two very different things, and for a long time, she chose the version of her life that required less confrontation. She had her reasons. Their daughter, Ava, was 7. Their son, Miles, was 11. And Marcus's mother, Diane, had a way of making Renee feel that any complaint she raised was really just proof she wasn't grateful enough for the life she'd been given. "You have everything," Diane told her once, at a Sunday dinner, apropos of nothing. "A husband who provides. 2 healthy children. Some women would trade places with you in a heartbeat." Renee had smiled and passed the potatoes. "There's one more thing about those early years you need to understand." Something Renee gave up quietly and never once brought up again. Stay with me. When Marcus was studying for the bar exam, the year before their wedding, money was tighter than either of them ever admitted to their families. Renee had one thing of real value, a thin gold ring that had belonged to her grandmother, the only piece of her grandmother she had left after she passed. She sold it to a jewelry buyer on the west side of town for $400, money that went straight toward Marcus's exam fees and study materials, and told him it had been sitting in a drawer anyway. She never told him what it actually was. She never told anyone. She simply let it become one more quiet thing she'd absorbed so his path could stay clear. Years later, at a dinner party, she heard Marcus tell a group of his colleagues, with an easy, self-assured laugh, "I put myself through the bar. Nobody handed me anything." Renee had been standing 3 feet away, refilling a wine glass. She said nothing. She simply refilled the glass and moved on to the next one. There's a second thing Renee never told anyone either, something far heavier than a ring, and something that would matter more than she could have known. Stay with me, because this is the part of her story most people watching this will recognize in themselves. After Ava was born, something in Renee simply didn't come back the way it was supposed to. The exhaustion didn't lift. The fog didn't lift. Some mornings she sat in the parked car in the driveway for 10 minutes before she could make herself go inside, gripping the steering wheel, waiting for whatever this was to loosen its hold on her chest. She mentioned it once, carefully, to Diane, hoping for something like understanding. "Don't be so dramatic," Diane had said, stirring her coffee without even looking up. Every woman goes through this. You're just being lazy. Marcus had been sitting right there at the table. He hadn't disagreed with his mother. He'd simply nodded, the small, practiced nod of a man choosing the path of least resistance, and changed the subject. Renee never raised it again with either of them. Instead, she found a therapist 40 minutes away, in a town where nobody from her life would recognize her car in the parking lot, and went every other Tuesday for over a year while Marcus believed she was running errands. She paid for it in cash, from a small account she'd quietly opened in her own name. The same instinct for a private safety net that would, years later, grow into something Marcus never saw coming. She told no one, not her sister, not even her closest friend, for a long time. She simply drove home from those Tuesday sessions with her face put back together, made dinner, and asked Marcus about his day. That single sentence, "Don't be so dramatic, you're just being lazy," is one Renee will hear again, much later in this story, from her own mouth, aimed at exactly the person who first said it to her. Stay with me, because that moment is coming. That was who she had learned to be. Patient, composed, the kind of woman other people described as so easy to get along with, which was really just another way of saying she had stopped insisting on being heard. But something had already started changing in Renee, quietly, invisibly, nearly a year before the trip to Chicago. And that's the part of this story you need to understand before we go any further. It started with a receipt, a hotel charge on a shared credit card statement, dated a weekend Marcus had told her he was in Detroit for a deposition. The hotel was in the wrong city entirely. Renee didn't confront him. She didn't even fully let herself feel the weight of it. She simply opened a new tab on her laptop, quietly, in the kitchen, after the kids were in bed, and typed a search she'd never expected to need. Private Investigator, Columbus, Ohio, discreet. That was the night everything changed, though nobody in her house would have known it. Marcus came downstairs for a glass of water, kissed the top of her head, and told her she should get some sleep. She smiled and said she would, right after she finished one more thing. She was not finishing an email. And this is where Renee's story starts to look nothing like the woman everyone around her believed she was. Frank Doyle had a small office above a dry cleaner on the east side of Columbus, the kind of place that didn't need to look impressive because his reputation did the talking. Renee found him through a family law attorney a former nursing school classmate had recommended, a woman named Angela Cross, sharp, no nonsense, the kind of lawyer who asked exactly 2 questions in the first meeting and let Renee's answers tell her everything else she needed to know. Before you do anything else, Angela told her, you need documentation. Not accusations. Documentation. Judges don't rule on feelings. They rule on paper. Renee hired Frank Doyle on a Tuesday in March. She paid him in cash from an account Marcus didn't know existed. More on that shortly, because that account is going to matter a great deal later in this story. Frank was methodical in a way that made Renee feel, for the first time in months, like she wasn't losing her mind. He didn't speculate. He documented. Dates, locations, patterns. Within 6 weeks, he had what he needed. Marcus had been seeing a paralegal at his firm named Talia Reyes for approximately 8 months. The relationship wasn't hidden particularly well. It simply hadn't occurred to Marcus that anyone was looking, because for 11 years, nobody ever had. Comment pause below if you would have confronted him right there with just this much proof. Or wait if you think Renee was right to keep gathering more before showing her hand. We want to know what you would have done. But documentation of an affair, Angela explained, while painful, wasn't always enough to secure the outcome Renee wanted, especially with 2 young children and a husband who made considerably more money and had, for years, controlled every financial account in the household. So Renee did something that surprised even Frank Doyle. She asked him to keep looking, not out of vengeance, out of necessity, because a woman who leaves a marriage with nothing rebuilds from nothing, and Renee had learned, slowly and privately over the previous 3 years, that a woman who prepares in advance rebuilds from something entirely different. And this is the part of Renee's story that nobody around her, not Marcus, not Diane, not even her closest friend, knew anything about. 3 years earlier, after a particularly cold comment from Diane about Renee not contributing financially the way a real partner should, something in Renee had quietly hardened. Not into anger, into strategy. She had a nursing license and a decade of clinical experience, and late at night, after Marcus was asleep, she began building something of her own. An online continuing education platform for nurses, study guides, certification prep courses, licensing renewal content. Built in stolen hours between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. on a laptop she kept in a drawer in the laundry room, a place Marcus never looked because he had never once done laundry in 11 years of marriage. She registered the business under an LLC with the help of a CPA named Dorothy Hale, who worked quietly out of a small office and asked no questions about why a client wanted every filing done in her name alone. The business grew slowly, then steadily. Within 2 years, it was generating enough for Renee to open an investment account Marcus knew nothing about, contributing to it every single month like a second, invisible mortgage payment toward a life she wasn't yet living. By the time she hired Frank Doyle, that account held just under $210,000. Renee had never touched a cent of Marcus's money to build it. She had built an entire second financial life in the corners of hours nobody else valued, while everyone around her believed she was simply a tired mother who had stopped trying quite so hard. She had never been unprepared. She had only ever been waiting. Stay with me, because the next discovery Frank Doyle brought her changed the entire shape of what was coming. In late September, Marcus told Renee he'd be in Chicago for 4 days for a firm conference. A real conference, he said, at a hotel downtown near the river. He'd mentioned the hotel name once, in passing, the way people mention things they assume will never be repeated back to them. He was wrong about that. Renee booked her own flight the following Tuesday morning, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside her laptop. She told herself, briefly, that she was doing this out of some flicker of hope, a chance to surprise her husband, remind them both of who they used to be before children and exhaustion and 11 years of small erosions. She knew, even as she clicked purchase, that this wasn't really about hope. Frank Doyle had already told her what she would likely find. Angela Cross had already begun building the legal case around evidence that existed independent of anything Renee would see with her own eyes. But there is a difference between knowing something on paper and knowing it in your body. Renee needed the second kind of knowing, the kind that would never leave room, in some private, exhausted, for a moment years from now, to wonder if she'd made the wrong decision. She flew to Chicago on a Thursday evening. She wore a dress Marcus had once complimented, 2 years earlier, a comment she had held onto the way you hold onto a receipt you're not sure you'll need again. The hotel lobby was tall-ceilinged and quiet in the particular way of expensive places built for people who don't ask prices. Renee didn't stop at the front desk. She already had the room number. Stay with me, because everything that happens in the next 90 seconds is the moment this entire story pivots around. She took the elevator to the 9th floor. The hallway was thick carpeted, quiet enough that she could hear her own footsteps, her own breath. She stopped outside room 918 and stood there for a long moment, feeling the full, physical weight of what she was about to confirm. Because this wasn't discovery. Discovery had already happened, weeks earlier, in Frank Doyle's small office above the dry cleaner. This was something else. Confirmation. The kind that exists only in your own senses, not in a report someone else compiled for you. She raised her hand to knock, and then she heard it. The hum of the air conditioning, laughter from somewhere down the hall, and then, unmistakably, from behind the door, a woman's voice. Easy, familiar, like someone who had been in that room before, many times, without any fear of being found. And underneath it, Marcus's voice. Low, warm, unhurried, in a tone Renee hadn't heard directed at her in years. Then came the words. Honestly, I don't think I ever really loved her. I think I just didn't want to be the one who left first. Renee stood absolutely still. The flowers she was still holding, she'd bought them at the airport, on impulse, some last flicker of the hope she'd told herself she wasn't chasing, slipped from her hand. She watched them fall to the carpet, one at a time, and counted them without meaning to. A nurse learns to count things when everything else is slipping. She did not knock. She turned, walked back to the elevator, and rode down 9 floors watching her own reflection in the polished doors, perfectly still, perfectly composed. Because it wasn't the affair that broke something loose in her chest. It was that sentence. 11 years, 2 children, a whole life built side by side. And the truth was, he'd simply never wanted to be the one to end it. She had spent over a decade being loved by a man who was only ever staying. And what Renee found when she got back to Ohio was something far darker than one conversation behind a hotel door. Stay with me, because Act 4 is where this story stops being about an affair and starts being about something much larger her husband's family had been hiding. Renee booked a separate hotel room that night, downtown, away from the conference. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened the Notes app on her phone, the same file she'd been keeping for months, dates, patterns, small inconsistencies she'd started documenting long before Frank Doyle ever got involved. She added tonight's entry and closed the app. Marcus came home from Chicago on a Sunday afternoon, kissed her on the cheek, and said the conference had gone well. Renee made dinner. She listened to him describe a client event downtown. She laughed at the right moments. She was very good at being still. She always had been. But what Renee did over the following 3 weeks is, according to psychologists who study long-term coercive marriages, one of the most misunderstood behaviors in situations like hers, and understanding it changes how you'll see the rest of this story. Experts who study control dynamics in long marriages describe a pattern. The partner who has been quietly diminished for years rarely leaves the moment betrayal is confirmed. Instead, there is often a period of what's called strategic stillness, continuing to function normally, precisely, while preparing the ground beneath the other person's feet. It isn't collapse. It isn't denial. It's discipline. Renee spent those 3 weeks being exactly the wife Marcus expected. She smiled at his colleagues at a firm dinner. She helped Miles with his homework and took Ava to soccer practice. And every Monday, while Marcus was at work, she sat at the kitchen table with folders Frank Doyle had delivered, going through 18 months of financial records line by line. What she found went far beyond Talia Reyes. Marcus had moved just over $70,000 out of their joint accounts over the previous year and a half. Small, staggered transfers, timed so no single withdrawal would draw attention on a shared statement. The money had gone into a private account Renee had never known existed. One Marcus had opened using a business address instead of their home address, specifically so nothing would arrive in the mail for her to see. And here is the piece of this story that even Frank Doyle didn't expect to find. Stay with me, because this next detail is the one that changed how Renee saw her entire marriage and her mother-in-law. Buried in a folder of forwarded emails Frank had obtained through entirely legal channels, correspondence Marcus had voluntarily copied to a personal account, now discoverable, was a message thread between Marcus and his mother, Diane, dated nearly 2 years earlier. In it, Diane wrote, "Whatever you're doing, keep it away from the house account. Renee doesn't need to know every detail of your life. Some things are between a man and his mother." Marcus had responded simply, "Understood. Thank you for covering for me at Easter." Renee read that message 4 times. It wasn't just that Marcus had been unfaithful. It was that his mother, the same woman who had spent a decade telling Renee to be more grateful, more patient, more understanding, had known for 2 years and had actively helped him keep it hidden. Every dinner where Diane made a pointed comment about Renee's shortcomings as a wife, she had known exactly what her son was doing and had chosen, every single time, to protect him instead. Renee sat with that for a long while before she felt anything at all. And what she felt, when it finally arrived, wasn't rage. It was clarity. The kind that rearranges everything you thought you understood about the people around you. Type 1 in the comments if you think Diane's silence was just as much a betrayal as Marcus's affair. Type 2 if you think that's not fair to put on a mother-in-law. We want to hear your take. Renee called Angela Cross the next morning. "I have everything," she said. "I want to move." But before Renee moved, there was one more Sunday dinner she had to sit through. And it may be the hardest scene in this entire story to watch. Stay with me. The following Sunday was already on the calendar. Diane's house in the older part of town, the same dining room Renee had sat in for 11 years, the same china Diane brought out only for family, as if the dishes themselves were keeping score of who belonged and who was merely tolerated. Renee almost canceled. Angela had advised her, gently, that showing no change in behavior was still the safest posture until the legal groundwork was fully in place. So Renee went and sat and passed the rolls and listened to Diane ask Miles about his math grades and Ava about her recital, and underneath all of it, Renee kept thinking about a single sentence in an email. Some things are between a man and his mother. At one point, Diane reached over and patted Renee's hand. "You look tired, dear," she said. "Are you taking care of yourself?" Renee smiled. I'm taking care of everything I need to, she said. Diane didn't catch the second meaning. Marcus didn't either. But Renee felt it settle into place inside her, quiet and certain, the way a decision feels once it's already been made and is simply waiting for its moment. Driving home that night, with Miles asleep in the back seat and Ava humming along to the radio, Marcus reached over and turned the volume down. My mom really loves having us over, he said. You should smile more when we're there. It means a lot to her. Renee kept her eyes on the road. I'll keep that in mind, she said. She meant it as exactly the kind of sentence Marcus was used to hearing from her. Agreeable, easy, unthreatening. It would be one of the last times he ever heard that tone directed at him and mistook it for surrender. That drive home was the last ordinary night of Renee's marriage, though nobody in that car but her knew it. Stay with me, because everything after this moves quickly. Angela Cross moved carefully. She was explicit from their first real strategy meeting. Everything Renee presented in court needed a clean chain of evidence. Nothing obtained by accessing Marcus's private accounts directly. Nothing that could be challenged as improperly acquired. Frank Doyle's documentation, the forwarded email thread that Marcus himself had voluntarily copied elsewhere, and 18 months of bank statements Renee had every legal right to review as a joint account holder. All of it was clean, thorough, and devastating. There was one more piece. Angela had identified, through the discovery process, that Marcus had been charging hotel stays and dinners with Talia Reyes to his firm's corporate expense account, misrepresenting them as client entertainment. Once flagged, that was a matter for his firm's internal compliance office, not just his marriage. Angela filed the documentation with Marcus's firm 11 days before Renee sat him down. Stay with me, because what happens in the next few minutes is the exact confrontation Renee had been building toward for months without Marcus ever suspecting a thing. It was a Wednesday evening. The children were at Renee's sister's house for a sleepover, arranged deliberately for that night. Renee waited until Marcus settled onto the couch with his phone, comfortable, unaware that anything had changed. I want to tell you what I found, she said. She laid it out without raising her voice. The transfers, the private account, the messages. She placed the printed documentation on the coffee table between them, page by page, and watched Marcus's face move through confusion, recognition, and finally the particular panic of a man realizing there was no explanation left to reach for. He didn't argue. He apologized. He said he could fix it, that Talia meant nothing, that Renee was the only one who mattered. Renee let him finish. Then she said, quietly, in the exact even tone Diane always used on her, "Don't be so dramatic, Marcus. Every man makes mistakes. You're just being weak." She let that sit for a moment before she continued, her voice never rising. "That's what your mother said to me, the year I could barely get out of the car in my own driveway. Do you remember?" You just nodded along. "I've carried that sentence for years. I'm only giving it back once." Something shifted in his face. Not anger. Recognition. The realization that the woman he had assumed would simply absorb whatever he gave her had, in fact, been watching everything, clearly, the entire time. 3 days later, Marcus's firm placed him on leave pending review after the expense account documentation was confirmed. 2 weeks after that, he was let go entirely. And when Renee finally faced Diane, the conversation that followed is one you are not going to want to miss. Stay with me for Act 6. Diane called 2 days after Marcus lost his job, her voice sharper than usual, instructing Renee to handle this quietly, like family always has. Renee, for the first time in 11 years, said exactly what she meant. "Diane, you've been handling my marriage for me since the day I married into this family. I'm done letting you." She hung up before Diane could respond. The mediation took place on a gray Tuesday morning in a conference room downtown. Marcus sat beside his attorney, visibly diminished, the confidence Renee had known for 11 years quietly gone from him. Angela Cross sat beside Renee, calm, precise, unhurried. 40 minutes into the session, there was an unexpected pause. Talia Reyes had asked, through her own attorney, for 5 minutes to make a brief voluntary statement, a detail Angela had been informed of that morning. Talia stood in the doorway, composed, and said she'd been told the Carters' marriage had already effectively ended 2 years earlier, that a separation was already underway, and that Marcus had discussed plans to restructure his finances around a future that didn't include Renee at all. She looked at Renee, not with hostility, and said simply, I don't think either of us got the truth from him." Then she left. It's natural to place all the anger on the other woman in a story like this, but experts in these dynamics point out something important. Stay with me, because what happened next reframes everything. Men who sustain long affairs while married, researchers note, often maintain two separate, consistent narratives, one for the spouse, one for the other relationship, each carefully calibrated to keep both people compliant. That doesn't remove responsibility from the choices Talia made as an adult, but it explains why she came forward, not to defend Marcus, but to reclaim her own story from the version he'd constructed for her. Renee looked at Marcus across the table and said, quietly, "Do you remember when I turned down the nurse educator position at Mercy Health 6 years ago? You and your mother spent 2 hours explaining why that would be selfish." Her voice didn't waver. "I called them back the next morning and said I wasn't available. Then I built something anyway, in the hours nobody was watching. I've been capable of supporting myself and our children for a long time, Marcus. Longer than you ever realized." The room went quiet. Marcus said nothing. There was nothing left for him to say. Before we get to the final act, there's one more moment from that day worth sitting with, because it says more about Renee than almost anything else in this story. Stay with me. After the mediation adjourned, Renee stood alone for a moment in the hallway outside the conference room, gathering her folder, her coat, the last 11 years of her life reduced to a stack of paper she now carried like something ordinary. Talia Reyes was still there, waiting near the elevator, and for a moment the two women simply looked at each other. Neither of them spoke first. "I'm not angry at you," Renee finally said. "Not anymore. He told you a story. He told me a different one. We were both just living inside whatever version he needed us to believe." Talia's composure cracked slightly, just at the edges. "I didn't know about the transfers," she said. "Or the mother. Any of it. I want you to know that." "I believe you," Renee said. And she found, standing there, that she did. They rode down in the elevator together in silence. Not as allies, not as enemies, just two women who had both been handed a version of the same man and were now, separately, walking away from him. Outside, the rain had started, the kind of thin gray Ohio rain that doesn't announce itself so much as simply arrive. Renee stood under the awning for a moment, breathing it in, before walking to her car alone. And that walk to the car is where Renee first let herself feel something other than clarity. Stay with me for the final act, because what she felt next is the part of this story every viewer tells us they remember most. The settlement gave Renee the house on Maple Crest Lane and a fair division of marital assets, weighted further in her favor once the court reviewed Marcus's 18 months of undisclosed transfers. She was awarded primary custody. Marcus moved into a small apartment across town and saw the children on scheduled weekends, which was all Renee had ever asked of him as a father, whatever he had failed to be as a husband. Diane called once, months later, her voice quieter than Renee had ever heard it. "I didn't know the full extent of what he was doing," she said. "I should have told you the truth a long time ago." Renee didn't rush to forgive her, but she said, "I hear you, Diane," and meant it. The last time Renee and Marcus sat across from each other, it was at a small coffee shop near her sister's neighborhood, weeks after everything had been finalized. Marcus looked smaller than she remembered him, quieter, a man who had run out of rooms to perform confidence in. Renee told him something she'd never said out loud to anyone but Angela Cross and Frank Doyle. "I hired a private investigator 7 months before Chicago," she said. "I already knew about Talia. I already knew about the account. I had already built a life you didn't know existed. The trip wasn't hope, Marcus. I already knew what I'd find. I just needed to hear it with my own ears so I'd never doubt, in some weak moment years from now, whether leaving was the right call." Marcus sat with that for a long moment. "I didn't know who you were," he said quietly. "No," Renee said. "You didn't." She said it without cruelty. "Just as a fact, the way you state something true once the grief attached to it has already been fully felt and set down." Renee drove home that afternoon past the same streets she'd driven for 11 years, past the same grocery store, the same elementary school drop-off line, and pulled into the driveway of the house that was now, fully and only, hers. Her daughter, Ava, met her at the door. "Mama, why do you look like that?" "Like what?" Renee asked. "Like something good happened." Renee smiled and sat down on the front steps, and Ava sat beside her without being asked. This story is a reminder that silence is not always surrender. Sometimes it's the most deliberate thing a woman can offer herself, not because she has nothing to say, but because she's choosing, with precision, exactly when to say all of it. Renee Carter didn't explode, and she didn't collapse. She watched. She documented. She built a life in the hours nobody else valued, long before she ever needed it. And when the moment finally came, she wasn't unprepared. She had simply been waiting. If this story resonated with you, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories of betrayal, resilience, and the quiet strength it takes to walk away.